thank you, Jeremiah, for taking the time to come and meet me. So it's an honour and a privilege to be sitting here with you. I think, by way of introduction, of course, I'm Simon Westbury, Strategic Advisor at 1xBet. I joined in July of last year now, it's 2026. So I've been here just over 6 months, and I've been at the forefront of the engagement of 1xBet with the wider industry, and talking with operators, regulators in the industry, primarily around player protection and reports that we've done there, but also engaging to tell 1xBet's story to the wider industry. Obviously, we're a global brand, and we've got a big presence in many markets, and I think we're going to focus on Africa today, and obviously Africa's a very key market for 1xBet. So my role is really just to put 1xBet on the front foot in terms of engagement with the industry, and interviews like this, which I'm delighted to give me that opportunity to spread the news. I think the aspiration for the company, for 1xBet, is to keep growing and keep getting stronger in the global gaming market. And I think that comes down to, and a key commitment from 1xBet is about regulated markets and gaining more and more licenses. In the last 6 months, we've gained a number of licenses since I joined in Serbia and Guatemala, for example, and it's expanding that global footprint. But part of that is expanding over our 35 plus local licenses now. But that's part of a more wide-ranging strategy, which looks at what I call the power of the 1xBet brand and how we mobilise that to be an effective leading brand in the industry, and that's done through what I call the 3 Ps: the power of the brand, the power of the product, and the power of the people. And those 3 come together to form 1xBet as a juggernaut going forward in the gaming space and into more and more regulated markets. And that's our key focus. We don't settle at just over 35 local licenses. We're looking to expand those licenses constantly, and that's my main role. I'll start with the reason behind player protection, and it's a key focus of 1xBet as we go into more and more regulated markets, and player protection is a key component of everything you do in regulated markets. It's to ensure that the player has a fun, enjoyable experience, but a safe experience. And that's the purpose of it. So we started with the report in Western Europe, and then we've done a report in Africa, which I'll talk on briefly in a minute, and then we're doing a report on Latin America. And the view of that is to bring it together in an announcement we'll make in the middle of March. But we're focusing on 3 key pillars, which is welfare, education, and research. And they are 3 topics of player protection we're focusing on. And when we link that to the Africa report, obviously the Africa report was very interesting because Western Europe's viewed as the bastion of regulation, or maybe the old mother of regulation. And Africa is obviously, as you know, Jeremiah, it's a continent, but it's a continent of many. And it's not monolithic, it's multifaceted. And the report was interesting because in Western Europe, we know that gambling is viewed as a source of entertainment. But the report showed, and this is from the respondents, this isn't just me saying it, that, gambling is viewed more as a life-changing financial gain experience. And obviously that's challenging around player protection because the report showed that in a lot of countries in Africa, player protection isn't part of the regulation. So the regulatory landscape was clear that it's some countries like Kenya and Nigeria and South Africa are a little bit more advanced than countries like, say, Benin. And we were seeing that many countries didn't actually include player protection within the regulation. And I think that's a key learning, not just for 1xBet, but the Africa gaming industry, that as the market evolves, player protection has to be included. And I think when you don't include player protection within the regulation, the onus is then on the operator. Now, there were some encouraging signs that 30% of operators were giving players, big win advice when they won big life-changing money on how to use that. But then obviously there were specific challenges around Africa and retail gaming, which is still very big. I know from my days selling virtual sports how big virtual sports are in retail, and then you've got the money management issues with the USSD mobile payments and the cash transactions. How do you protect the player? So there was many things that were very different to Europe, as you'd expect, but what was very interesting was that both Western operators and African operators were demanding more consistency from the regulator in regulation. Now, that's not asking for a one-size-fits-all regulatory roadmap, but just consistency in messaging and application if you're working in multi-jurisdictions, because one jurisdiction can have player protection and the other can't. I think we also saw a need for education around player protection, like players were self-excluding and then not realizing that they'd self-excluded and they couldn't come back. I think there was a bit of a technology gap. None of the respondents of the African operators are using AI technology in terms of player protection, but we saw that 74% of African operators that responded were deploying KYC checks against 73% of operators in Western Europe. So we're getting this very interesting picture globally of different regulatory standpoints. And we also saw, and I think this is maybe something Western Europe can learn from Africa, the prevalence of the offshore unregulated operators in Africa that are taking, in some markets, 25 to 30% market share. And I think we may see that in Western Europe with recent changes around taxation and regulation. So I think there's many lessons to be learned, and it's interesting to see these reports as they come to life. I think that comes what I mentioned earlier, the power of the brand. By working with AFCON and the Africa Cup of Nations and being shown to being committed to African sport, we're showing a dedication to the market. I've mentioned obviously over 35 local licenses. A number of those are in Africa, and Africa is a key growth market for us as a company. But to grow in any market, you have to engage in that market, and you have to engage in a localized way. Of course, there's the World Cup, and we'll be involved in that and somehow. But AFCON really gave us an opportunity to engage with Africa as a key market for us to grow. And I think, we see all the bright light sponsorships that we do, and they're fantastic to be involved in. But constant to that, we do some CSR programs as well. So in Nigeria, we had the 1x Cup, which is a massive tournament for amateur sports teams to come together to participate in the 1x Amateur Cup, and we used that platform to also engage in player protection, safer gambling, and also build trust in what we do with players, because I know in Africa, well, as in any market, trust is important, but it gives us brand awareness and trust. And also, we hope through our sponsorship, some of the sponsorship money filters back down into grassroots, benefits the wider community as well. So the aims are really to engage, but on many different levels. Honestly, 1xBet would love to be involved. Let me take that away from after this interview and see what we could do. I think what you're doing at that summit around player protection is very, very important, and it's important for the industry to engage, because gambling has a perception issue in any industry you work on. In Western Europe, it's viewed as now bad, and I've mentioned that previously. Like when I was younger, I used to go to weddings and say, I work in online gambling, and I was like the closest to a rock star I could ever be. Yeah. Now in Western Europe, you say, I'm working in online gambling, and people look at you slightly strangely. I think the challenge in Africa is slightly different. I think the challenge in Africa, as I mentioned previously, is gambling viewed as a life-changing financial gain experience rather than an entertainment experience. So we really need to focus on player protection in that prism to educate players that, you can win, but you can also lose, and you can't keep betting to try and change your life. And I think that comes down to education. But most importantly, and I hope you have this in your agenda, is to engage in regulators, because the regulators seem to be focusing on compliance in Africa and maybe taxation, and not including player protection. So I think 1xBet would love to be involved in discussion with regulators, because regulation is always organic, it's a live document that's always growing, so it can always change. And I think, we've seen recently in Mozambique some changes towards inclusion of player protection in the regulation. Cameroon has it, for example. But it is non-negotiable in my view, and I'd say 1xBet's view, to have a component of player protection within any regulated market. And I think that's what we'd hope to do at the conference, engage, tell our story around player protection, but also have some informal conversations that these conferences are great for with regulators to say, look, there's a gap in the regulation, how do we fill that? And I think with any regulation, it's making sure it applies to that market, applies to the cultural sensitivities and specifications of that market, to deliver the player, as I say, a fun, safe, enjoyable environment to gamble. On a high level, what I'd say is, it's non-negotiable to have a level of player protection in every jurisdictional regulation and regulatory environment. If you don't, then there's something missing. But I think maybe because I'm British and our colonial past, I'm always a bit nervous about saying this is what you should learn from others, especially in Africa. And I think actually this report, as I mentioned, showed that Africa's doing some things better than Western Europe. So let's reflect on that, but also understand that there needs to be player protection involved in all regulatory environments, and also a level of education to players about how to gamble safely and enjoyably and not focus on financial gain. And I think there's no one better to understand how they can do that than Africans and the African regulators. As operators, we're just there to give feedback and engage and have discussions to build Africa as a hub of gaming, which I know it is, but I think there's some gaps that can be closed.